How's it going, Ilan?
Good. Very good.
Have you ever been on a podcast before?
I have. I was interviewed. It was an interview before. I think it was New Books in Jewish Studies podcast, and it was this. And it was a really cool experience. That these guys they contacted me out of the blue. They're based in New York. They want to talk about my book. I mean, feel it's all exciting. Wow, someone actually heard of what I've done. And the interview was fun, except the connection wasn't so good. I think there was, IT problems either on his end or my end. So he would ask this question, and then I couldn't hear any of the question. All of a sudden, the connection would just die. Because we're doing it on Skype. And then he would say, so what do you, and then I'd hear the end of the question, just the last word. And I'm thinking, I've got to answer as if I heard what he said, but I have no idea what he just said. That happened a few times. So that was a bit odd. But otherwise, it was fun, and I know at least one person listened to it.
Nice.
Yeah.
They didn't have sophisticated stats on the.
I never checked.
Yeah.
They might. I know one person because I subsequently received an email from a guy in a Jewish community in San Francisco, and he said he wanted me to come to his community and talk about my research, talk about my book. And I said I'd love to, but I'm not so sure if I can easily make it out to San Francisco. And I'm trying to organize something for October, because I'll be out there. But so yeah, he's the only one that I'm aware of.
Interesting, cool. Yeah. So I know from our workshop yesterday, just from hanging out with you a little bit, that Jewish studies obviously has a lot of importance in your sort of intellectual perspective.
Yeah,
it's something you work a lot on, and you're obviously very interested in it. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about that. And sort of maybe I'd be curious to know, just maybe in general intellectual terms, what about the Jewish tradition do you kind of most identify with or find most sort of interesting or useful?
Okay, so many different questions there. So one of the things about Jewish studies is that although there are degrees in it, it's a really diverse and interdisciplinary group, but it's primarily historians. There's a few, anthropologists and sociologists, but it's very historical. And I don't have any training in Jewish studies. My training is in political science, political theory, international relations, international political theory. That's what I've done. And I ended up kind of moving into Jewish studies because I became increasingly interested intellectually and personally and politically, I guess all those go together, with diaspora Jewish relationships. The diaspora Jewish relationship with Israel. And that sort of work can fall into two different, disciplinary headings. One is Israel studies, and the other would be Jewish studies. I'm not really in Israel studies because I don't study, as it were, Israel specifically. It's more something about Israel than it is in Israel, if that makes sense. If that, sort of looking at it from the outside in, as opposed to, the topic that you're looking at is looking at Israel, as opposed to trying to understand what's going on in Israel, or I'm not so much concerned about Israeli foreign relations, that sort of thing. The constituency that I'm interested in is outside of Israel. So that meant Israel studies was not really right, and sort of Jewish studies became the, sort of the home. So I'm looking at journals, a lot of stuff. It's in Jewish studies, but I'm not a Jewish studies person. So I feel often when I go to the one Jewish studies conference I've been to, the Jewish studies seminar. I was at one in Oxford. I always felt really out of place. Here's these people who know way more than I do about the Jewish tradition, and then I'll get to the second part of the question. But the Jewish tradition, most of them are historians. There was a rabbi who was there. And then there's me, with political theory and international theory. So what's the connection? That's always a bit odd. What interests me in the Jewish tradition is a good question. Sometimes I wonder why is it that so many of the political theorists that I've been most interested in are Jewish. I wonder if that's just by coincidence or not. If there's something else going on there. I've always been very, very interested in Hannah Arendt for a very, very long time, and reading Arendt, and also when I read Levinas, and also quite a few of the Frankfurt School thinkers. But certainly, I think with Arendt, when I read her, to me, she's a Jewish theorist. And also to an extent, I would say with Levinas, and Buber also, who did a lot of research on Hasidim, I believe, as well as his philosophy. She's just a very, very Jewish thinker. I just see a lot of Jewish themes and sort of a Jewish reaction to the world and a Jewish reaction to how do we deal and how do we make sense out of these challenges that are arising, in the contemporary era. So in a sense, for me, Jewish content it's very difficult to identify. Most of Jewish studies will focus on Jewish history or some religious thing, right? And occasionally I'll bring, those in, but there's not. I mean, contemporary Jewish studies, at least in the UK, is a very small community. There's basically 3 of us.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I think the reason I ask is because I sort of have this kind of unlikely affinity with the Jewish tradition. Through some sort of accidents in my background and sort of my the people who just happen to be mentors to me at certain moments. In particular, probably one of my professors and mentors who was probably more influential on me than anyone intellectually in my life was one of my professors at Temple as an undergrad. His name's Aryeh Botwinick. I don't know if you would know his work, but he's a political theorist, and he was a student of Sheldon Wolin, and so that's sort of his lineage in some sense. But he's very interested in theology, sort of proper theology. If I recall correctly, he is a rabbi, and he would lecture. He would come to lectures in traditional Jewish garb. I don't know if that's the right way to put it, but
is he Hasidic?
Yeah, I believe so. My ignorance is revealing itself.
Like long black, black coat, that big black hat, that kind of thing.
Yeah, right.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly. Basically. In any event, yeah. So he was a very serious sort of Jewish intellectual, political theorist, theologian, and yeah, I just loved him. I admired him so much, and he was sort of the lecturer who sort of first really made me kind of think like, I want to live an intellectual life. I want to pursue sort of intellectual work for its own sake, just because of the enthusiasm and the passion and sort of erudition with which he did it. And I didn't really realize this at the time, but it was, I later came to learn that is kind of a part of the Jewish tradition, right? The sort of emphasis on learning for learning's sake. And so in some sense, I sort of have the Jewish intellectual tradition to thank for my own, development in some sense, even though I never really knew much about, Judaism or the religion or sort of the larger historical traditions. And then also my other mentors later, who would become very important to me, also happened to be Jewish and kind of issue intellectually from a kind of Jewish perspective. Yeah, and so ever since I sort of came to realize that, I've sort of had this special kind of affinity with Jewish thinkers and just sort of the Jewish tradition, but I'm still quite ignorant of it. It's just something that I've noted and something that I appreciate. So that's why I was curious what you sort of were most identified with or felt most attracted to in that tradition.
Yeah, I mean, it is my tradition. So there's a very reflexive component to this, and the work I've done on reflexivity highlights that. It's interesting I think in North America there's a disproportionate number of academics who are Jewish, and also in North America minority groups tend to be much more, I would say, confident in revealing their hyphenated status identity, right? Jewish or Latino or whatever. Whereas in the UK, well, not only is it a much smaller Jewish community, I forget the numbers, it's about a fraction of what it is in the United States. I don't think it's as represented in academia. And the other thing that's, and then so that's one. Two, the hyphenated identity here isn't as pronounced. So I don't know how often you would find, if you're a student that or knew that your professors or your teachers are Jewish. I suspect that a lot of the time that's not as public. And at least not initially. It becomes sort of thing like you find out later, in the sort of backroom gossip or backroom, the backroom talking where, little cliques, so-and-so, oh, right, so I think that's probably how it happens most of the time. And then the other thing is Jewish studies in North America and obviously in Israel it's basically Jews studying Judaism, right? And or Jews studying Jewish history. Whereas over here, it's not Jews studying Judaism or Jews studying Jewish history. It's people who aren't Jewish studying, Jewish history or Jewish tradition. So, at Durham, in where I'm the co-director for this Jewish Studies Center. I think there's only 2 of us in the center's in the membership of the center that are Jewish, and that's common in the UK and Europe, whereas in North America that's really unusual.
Yeah, that is interesting. So I mean, we could probably just talk about issues and questions that extend from this part of the conversation for the rest of it, but I don't necessarily want to pigeonhole. I don't want to pigeonhole us into a conversation only about Judaism and Jewish studies.
That's good. It's all
Israel.
good.
Anything else on your mind, or what do you think about? Yeah. Well, yeah. Like I said, just let it go in any direction you want. Maybe we might as well just jump into if it's cool with you, we just jump into even more controversial things.
Okay.
I read your piece on the Open Democracy piece on being a reluctant Zionist.
Oh wow! Yeah, I wrote that years ago.
Okay. Have you moved away from that, or do you still?
No.
Identify with that?
No. I got some. I think after writing that, it was either that or a related piece for Open Democracy. I got some pretty vicious hate mail.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I mean the thing is, once you start commenting on anything about Israel, you're in the firing line. I mean, I've had some pretty brutal correspondence, especially the stuff that I've written in Haaretz. One was really hard. No, sorry, it wasn't Haaretz. It was Ynet. It was translated into Hebrew for Yediot Achronot. It's one of Israel's main newspapers, and I got some vicious emails. I think the reluctant Zionist is still very much I think accurate. There's a guy in London named Tony Lerman who used to be the head of the let's see if I get this right, the JPR, the Institute for Jewish Policy Research, I think. I always forget. I know it's JPR, and it's really embarrassing. But anyways, and he wrote a piece, an op-ed for the New York Times not that long ago. And it's, I think the subtitle of it was, the death of liberal Zionism. And I think what I was getting at in that idea of the death of liberal Zionism are parts of the same coin. That there's this increasing difficulty with how, as a Jew, you're supposed to feel connected to a place that's doing and regularly doing bad things, and acting illegally, acting unethically, corrupt leadership, president, now in prison for sexual assault. You got all the corruption all over the place. The police force has got sexual assault, all up in the ranks. There's civil liberties problems. The occupation is nearing 50 years. One of the longest military occupations, if not the longest in history. It's bad stuff, right? It's like more bad news from the Middle East. But you still sort of maintain this connection to the place, then you become a reluctant Zionist. Yeah,
so I want to ask you more about that. I'd like to, because I thought that piece was very thoughtful. I mean, I appreciated it. I don't have the truth is that I don't have extremely strong or extremely confident intellectual grasp of what is obviously a complicated history and political situation. I definitely have the information that I have and the perspectives and the priors, if you will, that I have, but they're not extremely sophisticated, and I'm aware of that. So I want to kind of ask you maybe some interesting questions, but if they seem pointed at all, I just want you to know it's in very good faith, and I thought your piece was very thoughtful. So I'm very keen to really understand better your perspective, because you probably could teach me things I don't know, and also I want to it's probably worth being self-aware that I don't exactly know who the audience of this podcast will be, since I'm not releasing them quite yet. But my prediction is most likely it'll probably be kind of left-wing types with whom sort of pro-Palestinian attitude is probably going to be highly correlated. And that is, just to lay my cards on the table, that is kind of more or less what I have kind of been socialized into in some sense, but also what I have kind of intellectually felt out for myself as far as I've been able to understand the history and the situation. The attitude, as I'm sure you know, of course, I'm sure you've rehearsed it with people many times. The perspective, the general impression being that the Israeli state basically oppresses the Palestinian people, who basically just want to be able to live in peace in their homeland, right? That being sort of, I would say, the conventional wisdom from a significant part of sort of the radical left, especially, right? Obviously, I know it's not strange to you to hear that. I'm sure you've heard it many times before. But that being basically kind of the attitude that I tend to basically have when I think about it in a not very sophisticated way. But from what I know, and that being the position that a lot of people have, I'm very interested in having an interesting conversation with a highly educated, thoughtful, reluctant Zionist. So given that as sort of the background, right, in a somewhat opposed but good faith way, I wonder how would you sort of summarize the position of being a reluctant Zionist to someone like me and to my potential audience?
Yeah, I mean, I use the phrase reluctant maybe hesitantly. I think that probably the better term, because I don't think there's a reluctance so much, more than a discomfort about policy, is a better term is the one that Lerman was referring to when he talked about liberal Zionism. So, first it's important to understand what this idea is of liberal Zionism, and because let me start again. It's important to understand what liberal Zionism is because it defines, I think, a lot of how diaspora Jews in North America especially have come to understand their commitments to Israel. And it's a pluralist understanding. It's one that recognizes minority rights, human rights, the kind of democratic values that define, America idealized, right? So forget all the political theory and I think very accurate critiques of the violence inherent in liberalism. Liberal Zionism is Zionism with human rights, with minority rights, with respect for the rule of law in a democracy, and it's also a kind of Zionism that's never really existed in Israel because Zionism, even though it did address those issues, it was really and primarily an ideology of national self-determination. So even though you can find in Herzl's Als Neuland, this description of a very ideal state where you can see some of the liberal values, albeit 19th century liberal values, being articulated in his vision, the actual ideology of Zionism in practice was really we need to get a state, and how are we going to do it? With the exception of, I think, cultural Zionism, which wasn't so much interested in sovereignty. So liberal Zionism is really how diaspora Jews who are in North America and left-wing Jews in Europe who were not going to move to Israel but felt connected to Israel. And the reluctance, for me at least, and I think the argument that Lerman raises about the end of liberal Zionism is that a lot of the values that define this account of a socially progressive and just Zionism don't really manifest themselves in Israeli practice. So I was very heavily involved in Zionist youth groups from a fairly young age. I was a teenager, and the idea of Israel that we learned and the ideas of Zionism that we learned were infused with values of social justice. This was left-wing, progressive values. And we always just understood that's what Zionism involved. You had alternative groups, competing visions, but for us at least, that was the vision, is progressive, just, and Israel is supposed to be built on these values, supposed to be based on these values. The kibbutz was supposed to represent these values. He's very egalitarian. And the problem, though, is that those visions or myths or idealizations of Israel never really materialized. And there's I think since the 80s, especially since the Lebanon War, and then reaffirmed with the First Intifada, there was an increasing discomfort that became the support Israel right or wrong. We leave our morals at the door when it comes to Israel because we need to support Israel. And that's where the reluctance comes in. That's where the death of liberal Zionism comes in. It's where do these progressive, just, social justice values, where do they fit in when we see what kind of country Israel has become and Israel is going? But the other important part is that even though Israel is, does a lot of very unjust things, for many Jews, Israel is still based on an idea of justice. And that is not an idea that is easy to get rid of. And it's also why criticisms, kind of black or white, pro-Palestinian criticisms of Israel are so troublesome, is that one of the things they do, other than presenting the conflict in black or white, which is not very helpful, but is that they also have this. They ignore the moral underpinnings, right? The idea that Zionism was supposed to be a just project. Yes, there was going to be some difficulties, but it was supposed to be a just project. And the idea then that there was this impulse, this moral impulse, which, okay, maybe it's gone a bit wrong, but there was this moral drive to what was being done, and that moral drive is what animated so much Jewish support for Zionism when the diaspora Jews did come behind the Zionist project. The rejection of that is very, very painful, because it suggests that as Jews we don't have any moral values unless it's for our own kind. And I think a lot of the debate about Israel that's coming from, as you put it correctly, sort of left-wing Palestinian side misses that, ignores it, and is why, as Jews, we find so many criticisms of Israel that come from that constituency to be anti-Semitic.
Right. That's interesting. Okay, I think that's very interesting. So, I mean, you said a lot there, which I find interesting, but the first thing that I was getting from what you're saying is that, on the one hand, it seems that you do believe... I think something important to clarify is that you do believe that you can be unflinchingly honest and critical about the injustices of the Israeli state.
Of course.
And also be a Zionist, basically.
Yes.
So that, I think, is what is thoughtful about your position. I think because a lot of people... I mean, and in fact, sort of the pro-Palestinian sort of attitude that is so prevalent in the radical left, it's sort of so strong that it tends to, and I think you find this in many sort of patterns of sort of ideology in different spheres as well. It's a similar pattern where whenever attitudes towards something is strong enough, it sort of tends to color even the very words of other perspectives as, sort of unethical or sort of unquestionably wrong, to the point that it's interesting for me to think and reflect on the fact that in most of the circles I roll in, and sort of my just sort of political socialization, the very word Zionist is kind of like a bad word. Like no one, it's almost as if only bad people are called Zionists, right? Is the way that it almost functions mentally in certain groups, and so that's why I thought your piece was very interesting. And because you're basically saying that no, you can be unflinchingly honest and aware and critical of everything that's wrong about the Israeli state, and yet there is a deep vision of justice that is contained within the Zionist tradition or perspective that you think is worth holding on to, and that you believe in.
Yeah, I think that's normal, right? I mean,
the
most of the most Zionists. So speaking within the we're still talking about diaspora. I mean, in Israel, when we talk about Israel and Zionism within Israel, it's a bit different. But not in the sense that they don't have morals, not at all. But in the sense that it's more nationalism, or patriotism. It's a slightly different dynamic. The state is there, you're living. It's different. But if you're talking about diaspora Zionism, right, the connections of diaspora Jews to Israel, it's always had that. I mean, there's always been criticism. There's never been silence. It's never been, the Israel right or wrong view was it was more of a public face that felt, we need to stand together because here, as a Jewish people, we're used to being attacked. We're used to being, attacked, critiqued, assaulted, whatever. Now we have to come together and we need to put up a brave, strong face. But behind doors, there's always been a huge amount of debate, a huge amount of criticism. And even when Zionism, even before the State of Israel, even when Zionism was developing and growing as an ideology, it's not as if there's only one variant, right? There's many different versions of it. And a lot of debate within the Zionist, within Zionism, that eventually sort of narrowed as the practicalities of achieving a state started to present themselves. Okay, this is what we have to do. But even then, there's always this sort of normative dimension to what was being done. The other thing is about this that really annoys me about the black or white pro-Palestinian left account of the conflict is it's so hypocritical. I mean, one of the things that went wrong with Zionism, in my opinion, one of the things that went wrong with Zionism was the the way in which Zionism was articulated is sort of like without getting too jargony, it was the sort of the seeds its own destruction from contained within. It's an imminent critique within Zionism. The imminent critique within Zionism is you're trying to argue for a particular kind of just polity, but the polity that you're advocating is also necessarily and inevitably an inherently violent one. Why? Because you're taking your case and you're placing it into the big box of violence, death, and destruction that we call sovereignty in the modern nation state. Right? Zionism is built on the 19th century model of the nation state and of sovereignty, which, as both of us know, was an incredibly violent model. And that so you could have all this justice, but once you start to do that, okay, we may still we have some good ideas here. We want to be a socially just people, whatever. But once we're going to do this, okay, we have to fight for it, and that's what Avi Shavit's book, My Promised Land, which is a bestseller and it's really popular in the diaspora. It's not even published in Hebrew. That's what that book is all about, right? Without the political theory part in it. The thing about the thing that's missing within the left Palestinian camp is why would they assume the Palestinians would be any different, right? They're still arguing for the same thing, number one, and number two, it's not even clear what geography constitutes Palestine. Rashid Khalid's excellent book about the Palestinian national identity. It's quite dated now, and I met him briefly years ago. His book pointed out what could have been the boundaries of this ancient Palestine in the sense of a Palestinian nation, which is fairly recent, right? The idea of a Palestinian nation is fairly recent. That's not to lessen its significance, but rather to highlight that the territory of it, right, can't be going. You can't go back, millions of years because people move and identifications change and all that sort of thing. So it's fairly recent. It clearly doesn't reflect the boundaries of the contemporary Middle East, right? For a few reasons. One, it's relatively recent, and two, more importantly, the boundaries don't reflect anything other than the colonial ambitions, right? So if you talk about what would be Palestine, chances are it would have to include parts of Lebanon, potentially parts of Syria, although that's not clear, but it wouldn't be today's Israel and West Bank, today's Israel and West Bank or Gaza, right? It would be a different space. So there's this kind of odd irony that you have, in order to make the unequivocal Palestinian case for national self-determination, you have to challenge, right, the rights of Jewish national self-determination in a state that already exists, right? You have to question not only Israel's territorial borders, but also the makeup of the Middle East. And you also need to look at what the Palestinians have done for themselves. Now, I argue quite strongly that if I'm going to make the case for Jewish self-determination in Israel, then I have to also make a case for Palestinian national self-determination, and I fully support the rights of the Palestinians to have a state. I fully support the rights of Israel to exist. What those boundaries are, I'm open to suggestions, right? I don't really care so much about that. I think there's, we can be flexible.
Negotiated.
We can negotiate. We can think creatively, right? I'm not so wedded to that 19th century territorial sovereignty. I think there's ways that you can. I know it's not really going to happen that we could change in that sort of radical way, but at least if I'm speaking in the abstract, and I think in terms of moral principles, I'm I support both rights, and I'm open to how we then implement those. Okay. But let's look at for a minute the history of what the Palestinians have done, and they tried to assassinate King Abdullah, King Hussein's father. They were heavily invested in the Lebanese civil war, massively destabilized Lebanon. Because of that, were kicked out into Tunis, right? And the Arab countries used them as pawns to divert attention from domestic problems. The Palestinian people have, and this is the huge tragedy, and I'll say this, I probably shouldn't say this, but I'm going to anyways, it's pretty controversial. I don't think the Palestinians have any real friends internationally. I think they clearly have, as people, they clearly have friends. But as a people, in terms of the policy agenda, I don't think of a Palestinian state, I don't think they have any real friends. And I think a lot of the Arab world, certainly not. And I think the radical left or the left that's supporting them, I don't really think they're helping their case. I think actually what they're doing is the reverse. And the reason they're making they're not helping their case is they reaffirm this just crazy idea that if Israel were just to withdraw and give the Palestinians whatever they wanted, assuming that the radical left is even giving Israel, a space to exist in the future, if Israel just to withdraw and give the Palestinians what they wanted, that the conflict would end, that's a complete fantasy, right? And it's not because it wouldn't help, but it's because the history of spoilers in the Middle East has determined and driven the entire peace process or lack thereof.
Right.
So you walk away, you're still going to have violence, right? And Israel is then still going to have to respond.
Okay, real quick, just two things I'm thinking. The first is that I think I'm personally uncomfortable talking about the Palestinians, right? Because to me, it's like there's the sum total of the Palestinian people. Then there are different factions, of course, and different groups that do different types of things, right? So I'm just like I would never want to hold all Israeli citizens directly responsible for the injustices of the Israeli state. Mm-hmm. I also wouldn't want to hold the Palestinian people, all of them, sort of equally accountable for the actions of perhaps the PLO or Hamas or whatever it might be. Mm-hmm. So, and of course, I'm sure
that's why I distinguish between the people having friends and the people, right? Because what I'm talking about is as a political group, right? When they're fighting for their cause, which as I said, I think is a just cause. That has been done with I don't think with in the most effective of ways,
sure.
but regardless of strategy. No one has really helped them.
I see your point on that, and I think so. What I was going to say is that I think what a lot of people see when they look at the situation is they see, these sort of two competing groups, but one of them has all of these weapons and money, right, and a current sort of powerful state, and the other, is suffering obviously under pretty terrible conditions, which are sort of seen as enforced by the Israeli state. Mm-hmm. And so I think a lot of people look at that, and to them it's just an obvious sort of moral, ethical, political horror. And I think that basic, although it's simple and it's a kind of it is fairly simplistic. I think that view is at least reasonable. But I suspect that your sensitivity to the injustices of the Israeli state allow you to acknowledge that to some degree.
I mean, what comes to the thing that I think is the most frustrating for all of this is that, and the most tragic it's a platitude, right? You can only make peace with your enemies, right? And the thing here is that the Israelis or the Israeli state and the Palestinian the Palestinian potential state, that for them to exist, they need each other. Right? They're going to have to work together unless one of them is going to be eradicated, right? And I just refuse to buy into the logic that requires one of those peoples to lose their future and to lose their dignity.
And I agree with that, but a lot of people see the situation and it kind of looks like the Israeli state is intent on the extermination outcome.
I think that the Israeli state, I don't think they're intent on the extermination, although certainly a few within are. I think that the let's put it this way. I think the Israeli government, not the state. Let's put it that way. I think the Israeli government, for quite a few years now, has come to the conclusion that it is more, I don't want to say effective or more efficient to manage the conflict than to resolve it. That they've come to the conclusion that they're not going to get a settlement that they would be able to pass with the current government, right? Or even for that matter, the past few governments. They're not going to be able to pass in the Knesset. One. Two, the reason why it would be difficult to pass a settlement is that there would be very difficult concessions would have to be made, particularly about Jerusalem, and it would be hard to sell that to the Israeli public because what the Israeli public sees is the violence against them, right? Now, the thing is, and you see this in every country, it's always easier to see injustices elsewhere, right? So for the Israeli public, the military does bad things. Yeah, there's questionable policies. I mean, no. But the thing is, if you're living there, you don't see that. And it's not because it's hidden, it's because what you see is more overt, and what is more overt are the Palestinian suicide bombings, the shooting in markets in Tel Aviv, the stabbings, the driving into pedestrians, waiting at tram stations. I mean, that's what you see. And it's just like anywhere else, right? We don't see everything that's going on in Whitehall, but we do see, whoever crazy is happening to be running around shouting this, and, whatever platform they want. I mean, so I think we forget that. And it's not an excuse, but I think we forget that. So it'd be very, very difficult to pass it. The other thing is, it's also not really clear if there is a Palestinian leadership that would be able to, let's say, enforce a peace agreement. Right? The Palestinian leadership is very, very fragmented. It's also largely corrupt. And the Palestinians, you made the good point about, what is the Palestinian people? The Palestinians are at least a 3 or 4 part group, ignoring the Christian, Muslim, division. Cleavages. Well, that's not the right word, but the different, diversity within. You've got Palestinians in Gaza, led by Hamas. They're having a very different experience than Palestinians in the West Bank, right? Ruled, by effectively Fatah, the Palestinian Authority. You've got Palestinian refugees, right, within the Middle East. And then you've got Palestinian refugees who are living in the West. And all of them have got, different agendas, different perceptions, different needs. And it's very, very... And any peace agreement, in a sense, would kind of need to bring them together. And that's very, very hard when you don't have, a strong and legitimate leader who they'll follow and who can also make the difficult compromises.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think... I think reasonable people can probably disagree about certain aspects of the obviously of the ethical or political situation, and I think so. I actually kind of want just sort of acknowledging that basic reality that it's complicated and that I'm certainly not interested in settling anything here today, right? I want to actually go back to something that you said before that I quite liked or agreed with, which was that this idea that, or at least what I was thinking from listening to you at a certain point before, is this idea that no matter how sort of unjust the actual concrete political evolution of a particular idea becomes, no matter how tainted it becomes with terrible policies or whatever it might be, that doesn't give anyone the right to say that therefore what they deeply believe in that is good and defensible within that difficult, complicated tradition, therefore has to be rejected or let go of. And I also am very opposed to that position, which is very common, I think, in the radical left on a lot of issues. It's not just, it's a sort of structure of thinking, and in which case this is just one example of many, where it's like, you often hear it in some circles like, you have to, like, if you're an American, you have to hate America in some sense. Like, if you don't hate America, and you're not sort of, if you're not adequately self-loathing as an American, therefore you're unacceptably, immorally, kind of participating in the horrors of the American state, or supporting it, or shoring it up. And I think that's wrong. I think not only is that wrong, but I think it's violent and it's conservative in its own way, because I think you can't. There's this sort of left-wing posture of sort of saying, it's like the pattern seems to be like you seize on a particular sort of moral high ground that's like very obvious, right? Often very stark and simple, right? Whether it be the obvious sort of disproportionality between the power of the Israeli state and the seemingly helpless of Palestinian people, or the power of the American empire and the seemingly helpless people around the globe who the American state sort of dominates or whatever. You sort of seize on this sort of obvious and in some way undeniable moral disproportion or horror, and you want that to be a reason for everyone else to give up what is, for better or worse, the nature of their community, the nature of their identity in a deep way. And I just think human beings don't work like that, and they can't work like that. And you can't. People have the right to hold tight to what they believe in, especially when that constitutes their most fundamental community. No matter how much that idea or that or those ideals might be manipulated or put to unjust uses by especially what tends to be people higher up in sort of the social hierarchy. And I think that is a very sort of systemic kind of thought problem and kind of behavioral problem, especially in the radical left. Because what it does is it actually ends up pushing people away and pushing people further and further into precisely the kind of insular, polarized, antagonistic postures that I think I would think people on the radical left want precisely to transcend and kind of. Does that make any sense?
It does. I don't think they want to transcend it because it's so rooted in who they are. It's the kind of save the world types. It's this black or it gets back to the criticisms I was making earlier about the black or white approach to the conflict. It's I've got morality on my side. There's holier than thou attitude that comes with that, and anybody who doesn't live up to my standards is a failure. And not only, but because they're a failure in such absolutist moral terms, they effectively become kind of a lesser human being. And it makes it really easy then not just to attack their values and their views, but also to attack them as a person. I think you're right, and I think it's actually really ugly as well, and I think it's really unfortunate that. You can find that kind of that attitude on people who are trying to, at least in their own mind, are trying to make the world a better place, fight for justice.
I'm very fascinated by how that is, I think, one of the key mechanisms whereby the unjust status quo is reproduced in some sense. I mean, I think about this right now in relation to the Donald Trump phenomenon in the U.S. And the radical left and the left in some sense more generally has for a long time, basically treated poor white educated men especially as just sort of throwaway people. Like they're bad people. They're racist. They're sexist. They're nasty people. People don't say that, but that's how people who are now supporting Donald Trump have been rejected and kind of devalued by sort of the inherent sort of ideals and values and just ways of thinking and ranking people and types, especially by morality that is popular on the left and the radical left especially. And so it's like the fact that uneducated white men are sort of surging in support of Donald Trump and are being quite successful and powerful with it at this point. To me, I actually think the left is quite responsible for that because we have been treating these people as anathema. We've been treating these people as anathema for so long, but in fact, all they're really doing is what all people do, which is trying to make the best out of the world that they are given and trying to basically live the most sort of full identity and kind of coherent existence that they're able to salvage from the situation and the environment that they have, right? And I think the attitude where we have our sort of intellectual ideals and our judgments and our morals, and we look out at the world and we look at other groups and people, and we kind of judge people based on what we think the morality of their identity or their community or their tendencies tends to be. It's actually a way of saying we would rather be left to ourselves to feel moral. And we actually want other people to continue going on in ways that we find abhorrent, as if just because it's easier for us to process or something like that. But we actually in doing that, we actually sustain and are constitutive of precisely these sort of negative attitudes or behaviors that we pretend to be opposed to. Yeah. And that's, I think, a fundamentally common disingenuous attitude, especially from the left. If you can tell, I'm sort of I sort of roll on the radical left, and that is ultimately where my attitudes and ideas find, I think, the sort of the most useful outlet and the most useful vocabulary. But as you can tell, I have a lot of sort of there are a lot of things about the left sociologically that I think are really perverse, and that's kind of what I'm thinking about.
I think also I agree entirely with what you're saying. I think that, and also having rolled in those circles in the past, I think that there's also a part where you need to have those uneducated others that helps give you a sense of superiority. It's the vanguard, right? It's the elitism of the Mensheviks. We're the elite. We'll do it. We don't need the masses. And it was the Mensheviks. They were the elitists, right? Or was the Bolsheviks? Anyways, it's been a while. I think it's the Mensheviks. Anyways, it was Lenin, right? It was the elitists that it's been a long time since I did Russian history, but it was the elitists, right? Who are the vanguard, and they're the ones who. You don't need the rest, right? You sort of look down on them. Similar with the way Marx treated Engels, right? Similar kind of dynamic, and I think they sort of it's perverse. I think you also in the UK you're finding the exact same thing happening with UKIP, with the Labour Party, and when you play this, we'll know the results of the referendum, but. I don't think the Labour Party has. Well, let me rephrase that. When in the last election, everybody was saying, the Conservatives are the ones who need to be worried about UKIP, but actually it was Labour, right? The Conservatives were losing some people to UKIP, but what Labour missed was that they were vulnerable. And what you're seeing now is with the referendum is this huge fracturing of the two major political parties, right? Labour and Conservatives, with down this kind of the EU is if you will the proxy for this. I don't want to say it's the cause, but it's the in a way the driver of how we're seeing these splits really grow and I think reassert and enforce themselves, and it's coming down this kind of right-wing populism, right, that Farage has been able to exploit for quite a few years, and now that this snake oil charmer that's otherwise known as Boris Johnson is managing to leverage for his own personal ambition, and Gove, right, these are guys who are saying we're sick of elites. They are the elite, right, much like Trump, and it carries currency. The exact same thing has happened in Austria, right, where you had the presidential election. I was there when they were having them, the first ones, not the second, not the second round, but. And as you look, it's the exact same thing happening there. The major parties are fracturing. That there's a large group within the country that just don't see those parties as representing them anymore, speaking to them. And one of my colleagues buys into these are the losers of globalization. I think he's right. I think there's part of that which explains this kind of shift in that the Trump or the UKIP Brexit thing. The thing is, though, that when in the '90s, I grew up in the West Coast of Canada, right? So radical left, whatever, clearly a left-wing community by and large, and the battle in Seattle, which was happening during like a week before final exams. So I, being very studious, didn't go. Some of my friends went, one of whom never graduated. So I think I made the right choice, but. The battle for Seattle, what was the argument in the 90s against globalization from the left? It was reaffirm the state. Strengthen the state, right, to protect workers' rights, right, and that will stem the tide of, the neoliberalization of the market, that only the state can do it.
That was some of the argument. That was sort of the more trade union side of it, but there was definitely a significant sort of radical anarchist contingent that was saying basically smash it.
Smash everything, but forget them. And I know the group, but they, the one that was, I think, had greater currency, right, just in terms of demographics, was strength in the state, right, because the unions were involved.
Yeah, and it definitely at least media voice, right?
And media voice.
That's the only kind of argument that gets airtime.
Yeah, because if you're breaking, if your whole view is just smash everything, you're not going to get very.
To be fair, the smash everything is sort of shorthand for what can actually be more sophisticated arguments and perspectives. So to which I'm actually quite sympathetic. But
right.
but go on. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So I'm not saying those are the only voice, but that was a major one. I think we can agree on that. So
sure, the trade union one,
the statist one,
yeah.
And you even, I think you got Naomi Klein on your shelf, and there's this argument within that side left that we need to protect, and it's either we need to protect our community, and it usually comes down to some kind of territorialized defense mechanism,
right?
And that was the same argument on the right.
Right.
So, it was, obviously they had different understandings, the content of it, but the general structure was the same. And I think and that was where that's where the third way came in, right? That's where, Clinton and, certainly Blair, who I think now is rightly a pariah, but that's where they came in. And I heard Gordon Brown speak recently in Newcastle, the former Prime Minister, and he was also still speaking that kind of way but he modified it a bit. He had said, the force of globalization can only be confronted together. right, collectively, and that's why he's saying, we need to remain in the EU, and I think he's right on that. But there's that polarization of the right and the left. Sorry, not the polarization. The arguments of the right and the left that effectively are about strengthening some kind of territoriality as a response to just never really worked. Mm-hmm. And I think that, and over time, as the forces of neoliberal capital, right, have managed to get away with highway robbery, right, over the years, it's just become harder and harder and harder for people to see an alternative. They see the systems being complicit in it. They see the major parties as not really being able to answer to it, and they're looking for others. And that's when you get this kind of right-wing populism, and they latch on to easy targets like immigration.
Yeah, that's interesting. Sometimes I think that we have all become so fucked by global capital so dramatically and rapidly over the past several years, or decades, I suppose, that in some sense I sometimes interpret all kinds of diverse sort of political phenomena, especially ideological phenomena, as all just sort of a bunch of different variations on what is like a basic kind of mass confusion about what the fuck to do, given the overarching power realities that leave us all pretty helpless at this point. Like I almost, when you take a step back and you almost see all of the different sort of views that are being put forward in the public sphere, all the different sort of groupings that are occurring and cleavages that are opening up. Sometimes I take a step back from it all, and it's almost like if you don't listen too closely to what anyone's saying, you can kind of understand it all as like we're all just fucking freaking out because it seems to be that liberal democracy is dying, perhaps, and we don't know what to do, and we're all really scared. So it's like everyone is sort of grasping at identities and attitudes and ideologies and behaviors that, just given their sociological grouping and position in society, seem immediately most available to them to kind of like hold on for dear life. Do you know what I mean?
Totally. And I think Marx is right in this. We are seeing this is the seeds of sowing the seeds of its own destruction. I think what we're seeing now is in the long game the fragmentation of the West in a way that we haven't seen before.
Fragmentation of the West. Do you think, is this the end of Western civilization, or do you have this kind of perspective?
I don't know if I'd say the end of Western civilization. I mean, it's if it depends. As a student, teacher, scholar of international relations, the West is still so hegemonic that in some ways I don't know if that's a very interesting question or an easy one to answer.
But we do. But also as scholars of world history and things like this, or just as people knowledgeable about world history, we also know that all civilizations rise and fall.
Exactly.
Eventually.
Eventually.
So in some sense, it's not even that dramatic of a hypothesis.
I mean, I think that what is happening, I don't know if it's necessarily the decline. I mean, I think maybe it's decline of certain parts of the West. I think we're seeing the decline of the United States. I think that's happening because it's just the political system is just such a mess, and it's also so prone to corruption that I think we're seeing all that starting to really assert the problems, really assert themselves, and I think it's managing to get away with it because of the size, the economy, the military, the usual sort of realist markers. It's enabling it to kind of, I think, float above its station than it probably otherwise would be. But I think what's happening is I was talking. It's hard to when Cameron came out and he was talking about if we leave, it's that could bring the future of war. I think he was right. I don't think he expressed it very well, and I think it's a very difficult argument to make. But I think he was onto something. I think that what he was trying to say, in which others have now said, is that the argument for leaving the EU. And a lot of the resentment across Europe, not just in the UK, but across Europe towards the EU and concerns over immigration, are tied to this kind of parochial nationalism that I don't think we've really seen assert itself so powerfully since, I don't know, I want to say like the early 20th century. I mean, I'm thinking here from, in terms of conflict from, Gallipoli up to the First World War and then leading into the Second. And I think that what they see is if we do go down this road where the future of the country is understood in these very xenophobic and very parochial worldviews, that you are leading into a future world of increased conflict and decreased cooperation. And I think they're right. I don't know what that'll manifest itself as. I'm not saying there'll be another European war.
Right.
There has been, right? In the Kosovo, but I'm not. But there, it's certainly plausible that there could be conflicts. And I don't think that this idea. And the other thing that I think is important here is the target that's being used, being labeled as a threat, is Muslim extremists, ISIS, terrorism, whatever. And then, of course, becomes the enemy within. Well, where have we heard this kind of stuff before? This isn't new. We've seen this before. And all of that really scares me. And I think that it's a very difficult argument to make, politically when you're trying to get people to vote for you. It's hard to do. But I think he was right. I think, and it's just unusual because I usually disagree with everything David Cameron says.
Yeah. Okay. I see that point. I think you put that intelligently. Definitely. I think I might have to let that be the last word, but I'll let you have the last word.
No, I don't need it.
I hate to be abrupt, but
time is up,
and that was about an hour, so that's good.
Yeah.
And that was a really fun, interesting, wide-ranging conversation. Did you enjoy it?
I did. Thank you very much. I hope I don't get too much hate mail after you said that. I said some controversial stuff, so we'll see what happens when it gets posted.
I don't know. Controversial, sure, but nothing you said struck me as offensive or.
I've tried not to be.
I think reasonable people can disagree. Yeah. And I think people, one of the reasons I wanted to do this podcast is because I think people are really becoming just increasingly allergic to people who disagree with them. And I think it's really, really sad. It's like there's this, people are becoming increasingly just in a really knee-jerk way, in a really deep kind of gut way. In their gut, they're like just viscerally incapable of sitting at a table with someone who they might not totally agree with.
I have to say this because I think I think social media has a bit to the role here. Where it's able to filter, so you only see stories that you would it's able to filter stories through algorithms, so it only presents news and other stories that you would agree with or that are consistent with what you've seen. But where else do we see this? We see this in this insane politically correct argument on undergraduate students. They get rid of roads. At Oxford, similar sort of things in the States. This kind of, I'm going to use this phrase intentionally, this whitewashing of history because I don't want to be offended. And I think you're right. It's some honest and friendly debate is a good thing.
Well, that's definitely okay. Well, I'm glad we both agree on that. Yeah. What you just mentioned, that's a whole other can of worms that I would love to have another podcast on. That's something that kind of comes up a bit on this podcast that I've had a few times. But and I think that what you're alluding to is fair generally. I think I'm not so quick. I'm not saying you're doing this, but I'm not so quick to sort of poo-poo all of it. But I do agree that there are certain dynamics in sort of contemporary culture that you were kind of pointing to that are more troubling than promising, especially even from sort of the radical left kind of liberationist perspective.
We feel there's a right not to be offended, and I think there's a right that at a certain point, racism, sexism, etc. Yeah, but there's also there's the problem is saying if you live in the world, you have to be able to recognize the bad stuff that's happened so you can overcome it. If you just forget it, try to erase it, I don't see how that takes us into a better place.
Right. Yeah, I definitely agree. Yeah. So I really like having conversations with people that I don't even know if I agree with them or not in advance, and why should you? That's the point of the conversation, right? To learn that. And so that's actually one of the kind of the goals behind the podcast. And so this has been a really good example of that. It's been a pleasure speaking with you. And
same.
Yeah, it's been good. Thank you very much for coming on.
Yeah, thank you.
Totally. Cool.
Yeah.
And obviously I'll let you, once these start going live, I'll send it to you for sure.
Please do. I want to hear some of the other speakers. I know one of them.
Cool. All right. Let me click this off.